The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. At 23, James had been guarding the Queen for 2 years, and he knew the rules by heart. Stand perfectly still, never speak to tourists, never break formation, never show emotion. But today would be different. As tourists began gathering behind the metal barriers, James noticed a small family approaching. A mother walked slowly, pushing a wheelchair that carried a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The child wore a bright blue hospital gown under his jacket, and a knitted cap covered his head. His thin arms rested on a small blanket decorated with toy soldiers. The boy's eyes widened as he saw James standing at attention. Despite his obvious illness, his face lit up with pure joy. He whispered something to his mother, pointing excitedly at the guard's uniform. The woman smiled sadly and wheeled him closer to the barrier. James had seen many sick children visit the palace over his years of service. It always tugged at something deep inside him, but his training kept him frozen in place. Today, however, something felt different. The boy wasn't just looking at him with curiosity like most children did. There was something deeper in his gaze, a mixture of wonder and sadness that seemed far too mature for such a young face. The child's mother leaned down and spoke quietly to her son. James couldn't hear the words, but he saw the boy's face fall slightly. The woman looked up at James with apologetic eyes, as if she was sorry for bothering him. She began to turn the wheelchair away when the boy reached out his small hand toward the guard. "Please, Mummy?" The child's voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet morning air, James heard every word. "Can I just touch his hand? Just once?" James felt his heart clench. The mother's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. The guards can't move or talk when they're working. It's their job to stay very still." The boy nodded with the understanding that only children facing difficult circumstances seem to possess. He didn't cry or throw a tantrum. Instead, he simply smiled at James and gave him a small wave. "Thank you for keeping the Queen safe," he said softly. Those words hit James harder than any training exercise ever had. Here was a child who was clearly fighting his own battle, yet he was thinking about others. The boy understood duty and sacrifice in a way that most adults never would. As the family began to move away, James made a decision that would change everything. His superior officer was checking the other end of the courtyard. The tourists were still sparse in the early morning, and this little boy needed something that James could give. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, James began to move his right hand. It was the smallest gesture, just a few inches, but to the boy watching, it might as well have been magic. James gave the child the tiniest wave, barely more than a twitch of his fingers. The boy's face transformed completely. His mouth fell open in amazement, and he turned quickly to his mother. "Did you see that, Mummy?" "Did you see?" "The guard waved at me." The mother looked back at James, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," as tears rolled down her cheeks. James returned to his position, standing perfectly at attention as if nothing had happened. But inside, everything had changed. That small moment of human connection had reminded him why he truly served, not just to protect a building or follow rules, but to represent something bigger. Sometimes the most important duty was simply to show kindness. The family stayed for a few more minutes, with the boy beaming as he told his mother about every detail of James's uniform. When they finally left, the boy turned back one more time and waved goodbye. James couldn't wave back, not with other tourists now watching. But he hoped the boy knew that somewhere beneath the formal uniform and strict training, a friend was waving back. That evening, as James removed his uniform and hung it carefully in his locker, he thought about the boy. He wondered about his story, his illness, and whether that visit to the palace had brought him even a moment of joy. James had broken protocol, risked his career, and violated years of training, and he knew he would do it again in a heartbeat. 3 months after James's encounter with the young boy, word had somehow spread quietly among the guards, not through official channels, but in the way that meaningful stories always travel. Whispered during shift changes, shared over late-night cups of tea, passed along with knowing looks. Sergeant William Hayes had heard the story third hand. At 45, he was a veteran of 22 years in the Guard, a man whose face had become as unchanging as the palace stones themselves. He had trained dozens of young guardsmen, always emphasizing the same principles: discipline, tradition, and unwavering duty. But William carried his own secret. 15 years earlier, his own daughter Emma had spent months in the hospital fighting leukemia. He knew the look of hospital corridors, the sound of monitors, and the weight of watching a child suffer. Emma had recovered, thank God, but those memories never fully faded. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, William stood guard at the main entrance when he noticed an elderly woman approaching with hesitant steps. She moved slowly, aided by a walking stick, and kept glancing nervously at the guards. Her gray hair was neatly pinned under a small hat, and she wore a faded blue dress that had clearly been her best once upon a time. Behind her walked a younger woman, presumably her daughter, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The child wore a bright yellow dress and clutched a small stuffed corgi that looked remarkably similar to the Queen's beloved pets. The grandmother stopped about 10 feet away from William and began rummaging through a worn handbag. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and unfolded it carefully. Her hands shook slightly as she read whatever was written there. "Excuse me?" she called out softly, her voice carrying a Welsh accent. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you." William stared straight ahead as protocol demanded, but he listened. "My name is Margaret Davies," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've come from Cardiff with my granddaughter. Lily, we've saved for 2 years to make this trip." The little girl peered out from behind her mother's legs, her eyes wide as she stared at William's impressive uniform. Margaret took a shaky breath and continued. "You see, my late husband Robert served in the Welsh Guards for 30 years. He passed away last month, and with his final words, he asked me to bring Lily here. He wanted her to see where he served, to understand what it meant to him." William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Welsh Guards held a special place in his heart. They were brothers in arms, part of the same proud tradition. Robert always told Lily stories about the palace, about the honor of serving the crown. She's only 5, but she understands that her grandfather was special, that he was a guardian just like in her fairy tales. The little girl stepped forward, still clutching her toy corgi. "My granddad said the guards are the bravest people in the whole world," she announced in a clear, sweet voice. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I know you can't speak while you're working, and I don't want to cause any trouble. I just wanted Lily to see a real guard the way her grandfather was. It would have meant everything to Robert." William felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't just about a tourist wanting attention or a photo opportunity. This was about honoring a fallen comrade, about keeping a promise to a man who had served with the same dedication William showed every day. The courtyard was relatively quiet. His commanding officer was inside the building. The other guards were positioned far enough away that they couldn't see clearly what he was doing. Very slowly, William turned his head just slightly toward the family. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but to Margaret and Lily it was everything. "Oh, my word," Margaret whispered, pressing her hand to her heart. Little Lily gasped and took a step closer. "Mummy, he looked at me. The guard looked at me." William couldn't smile. His expression had to remain neutral, but he held the little girl's gaze for just a moment longer than regulation would allow. In that brief connection, he tried to convey everything he couldn't say: respect for her grandfather's service, understanding of their loss, and recognition of the love that had brought them so far from home. Then, in a gesture that would have shocked his instructors but felt absolutely right in his heart, William gave the slightest nod. It was barely perceptible, but it was unmistakably meant for them. Lily's face lit up like Christmas morning. She turned to her grandmother with excitement bubbling over. "Granny, did you see?" He nodded at me. "Just like Granddad said he would." Margaret's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of joy and gratitude. "Yes, sweetheart, I saw. Your grandfather would be so proud." The family stayed for several more minutes, with Lily asking her mother quiet questions about William's uniform, and Margaret sharing whispered stories about her husband's own time in service. When they finally prepared to leave, Margaret approached as close as the barriers would allow. "Thank you," she said simply. "From one military family to another, thank you for honoring his memory." As they walked away, Lily turned back and waved her little corgi at William. This time he couldn't acknowledge her. Other tourists had gathered and were watching. But he stored that image in his memory. A little girl in a yellow dress, proud of her grandfather's legacy, carrying on a tradition of respect and service. That evening, William called his own daughter Emma. She was 27 now, healthy and strong, working as a teacher in London. "Dad?" Emma answered, surprised by the unscheduled call. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, love," William said, his voice softer than usual. "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of you, and how grateful I am that you're here." "That's sweet, Dad. What brought this on?" William looked out the window of his small apartment, toward the palace where he would return tomorrow. "Just remembering what's truly important," he said. "Love you, Emma." "Love you too, Dad." As he hung up the phone, William thought about duty and tradition, about rules and compassion. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest service came not from following orders blindly, but from recognizing the moments when humanity mattered more than protocol. The rain came down in steady sheets that October afternoon, turning the usually bustling palace courtyard into a gray, soggy landscape, dotted with colorful umbrellas. Most tourists had sought shelter in nearby cafes, leaving only the most determined visitors to brave the weather. Guardsman David Chen stood at his post, water dripping steadily from the brim of his bearskin hat. At 26, he was used to London's unpredictable weather, but this downpour was particularly harsh. His red tunic was soaked, and he could feel water seeping through his boots, but he remained perfectly still, as he had been trained. Through the rain, David noticed a commotion near the palace gates. A woman was arguing with one of the security staff, her voice growing increasingly distressed. She held a large umbrella over what appeared to be a small child, but David couldn't make out the details from his position. "Please, you have to understand," the woman's voice carried across the courtyard. "She's been planning this for months. It's all she talks about." The security guard shook his head sympathetically but firmly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't make exceptions. The tours are canceled due to the weather. It's for everyone's safety." David watched as the woman's shoulders sagged in defeat. She knelt down beside what he now could see was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing a bright pink raincoat and matching boots. The child was in a small wheelchair, decorated with stickers of princesses and castles. The little girl looked up at her mother with eyes full of disappointment but trying to be brave. David couldn't hear their quiet conversation, but he could see the child's face crumple slightly before she forced a smile and patted her mother's hand reassuringly. Something about the scene struck David deeply. His younger sister Amy had been born with spina bifida and used a wheelchair. He knew the challenges these families faced, the extra planning required for every outing, and how crushing it could be when those carefully laid plans fell through. The woman stood up, clearly trying to figure out their next move. The little girl pointed toward David and said something to her mother. Even from a distance, he could see the child's face light up with interest as she noticed his uniform. The mother hesitated, then began pushing the wheelchair slowly toward David's position. As they got closer, he could hear their conversation. "Look, Mummy, it's a real Queen's Guard. Just like in my books." "Yes, sweetheart, but remember what we talked about." "The guards can't talk when they're working." The little girl nodded solemnly. "I know, but I can look, right?" "Of course you can look." They stopped about 6 feet away from David, the mother holding the umbrella over both herself and her daughter. The little girl stared at David with obvious fascination, taking in every detail of his uniform despite the rain. "Mummy, why does he have to stand in the rain?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "It's his job, sweetheart. The guards protect the Queen no matter what the weather is like." The child considered this seriously. That must be very hard, and very cold. David felt his heart warm despite the chill rain. This little girl dealing with her own challenges was worried about his comfort. "My name is Sophie," the child announced, as if David could respond. "I'm 7 years old and I came all the way from Manchester to see the Queen's house. We were going to go inside, but it's too rainy." The mother smiled sadly. "We've been saving up for this trip for a long time." Sophie has a collection of books about the royal family, and meeting a real guard was at the top of her wish list. Sophie reached into a small bag attached to her wheelchair and pulled out a slightly damp drawing. "I made this for the Queen," she said, holding it up. "It's a picture of her with her dogs. Do you think she would like it?" David looked at the drawing, a child's colorful interpretation of the Queen surrounded by several corgis all wearing crowns. It was clearly made with love and care, despite the simple stick figure style. The rain was getting heavier, and David could see that both Sophie and her mother were getting soaked despite the umbrella. The sensible thing would be for them to leave and find somewhere warm and dry. But something about Sophie's hopeful expression and her mother's disappointed face made David make a decision that went against every rule he'd ever learned. Very carefully, making sure no officers were watching, David did something unprecedented. He took one small step forward, moving just outside his designated position. It was a tiny movement, but it brought him closer to Sophie's wheelchair. Then, in a gesture that could have ended his career, David slowly reached out his hand toward the drawing Sophie was holding. He couldn't take it, that would be going too far, but he made it clear that he was looking at it, acknowledging it. Sophie's gasp of delight was audible even over the rain. "Mummy, he likes my picture." "The guard likes my picture." The mother looked up at David with tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. David gave the smallest possible nod, then very slowly stepped back to his original position. But he continued to look at Sophie, making it clear that she had his attention. Encouraged by this unprecedented interaction, Sophie began telling David about her drawing in excited whispers. She explained each corgi by name, described the Queen's crown in detail, and shared her dream of maybe meeting the Queen someday. "I know you can't talk back," Sophie said, "but I hope you know that you're very brave to stand in the rain like this. If I could walk, I would want to be a guard too, protecting important people." David felt a lump form in his throat. This remarkable little girl, facing challenges that would defeat many adults, spoke about bravery and service with such pure sincerity. As the rain began to ease slightly, the mother realized they should probably head back to their hotel. "Come on, Sophie. We should let the guard get back to his work without us bothering him." "We're not bothering him, are we?" Sophie asked, looking directly at David. In another breach of protocol, David gave another almost imperceptible shake of his head. Sophie beamed with joy. As they prepared to leave, Sophie held up her drawing one more time. "This is for the Queen, but I want you to remember it too, okay? So you know that there's a little girl in Manchester who thinks you're the bravest person in the world." After they left, David stood in the diminishing rain, thinking about courage and duty. Sophie had taught him something important that day, that sometimes the greatest bravery comes not from following rules perfectly, but from choosing kindness when it matters most. When his shift ended, David found himself walking past the hotel where he suspected Sophie and her mother might be staying. Through the lobby window, he saw them in the restaurant, Sophie excitedly showing her drawing to other diners and telling them about meeting a real Queen's Guard. David smiled to himself and continued walking home. Tomorrow he would return to his post, stand perfectly still, and follow every regulation to the letter. But he would also remember a little girl named Sophie, who reminded him that sometimes the most important part of serving others is simply letting them know they matter. The first snowfall of December had transformed Buckingham Palace into something from a fairy tale. White flakes drifted down like nature's confetti, coating the courtyard in a pristine blanket that muffled the usual sounds of the city. For Guardsman Marcus Thompson, it was his first Christmas season at the palace, and the magic of the moment wasn't lost on him despite his stoic training. At 24, Marcus was still adjusting to the weight of tradition that came with his role. His grandfather had served in the same regiment 40 years earlier, filling young Marcus with stories of honor, duty, and the pride of protecting the crown. Those stories had inspired Marcus to enlist, but they hadn't fully prepared him for the emotional challenges of the job. The early December afternoon brought fewer tourists than usual, but those who braved the cold seemed more determined to make their visit special. Marcus watched families hurrying past with shopping bags and cameras, their breath visible in small puffs as they marveled at the palace's winter transformation. Around 3 o'clock, Marcus noticed an unusual group approaching. An older gentleman walked slowly with the aid of a cane, his military bearing still evident despite his age. Beside him, a middle-aged woman pushed a stroller containing what appeared to be a sleeping toddler bundled in winter clothes. But what caught Marcus's attention was the older man's jacket. Beneath his civilian coat, Marcus could see the edge of military medals. As they drew closer, Marcus could make out more details. The elderly gentleman wore the distinctive pin of the Coldstream Guards on his lapel. His posture, even aided by the cane, spoke of decades of military discipline. The woman with him, likely his daughter, kept glancing at him with a mixture of pride and concern. They stopped near Marcus's post, and the old soldier stood as straight as his aged body would allow. For a long moment, the two guards, one young and active, one old and retired, simply observed each other across the generations. "Grandpa, tell me again about when you stood here," the woman said softly, adjusting the blanket around the sleeping child. The old man's eyes never left Marcus as he began to speak. "I was about his age when I first took this post," he said, his voice carrying the authority of experience. 1963 it was. Different world then, but the same pride, the same duty. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. He was standing in the exact spot where this veteran had served decades ago, part of an unbroken chain of guardsmen stretching back through history. "I brought my son here when he was small," the veteran continued, nodding toward the woman beside him. "Now I wanted little Thomas to see where his great-grandfather served." He looked down at the sleeping toddler with infinite tenderness. The woman, presumably his daughter, spoke up. "Dad's been in hospital most of this year. This is his first time out in months. When the doctors said he was strong enough for a short trip, this is the only place he wanted to come." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. Here was a man who had stood exactly where Marcus now stood, who had served with the same dedication, now nearing the end of his journey and choosing to return to this sacred place. The veteran reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Even from his distance, Marcus could see it showed a much younger version of the man, standing at attention in the same red tunic Marcus now wore. 43 years I gave to the service," the old man said, his voice growing stronger with memory. "Best years of my life were spent right here protecting something bigger than myself." The sleeping toddler stirred slightly, and his great-grandfather's expression softened completely. "I wanted young Thomas to see that his family has a tradition of service. Maybe one day he'll understand what it means." Marcus was deeply moved by the scene before him. This wasn't just a tourist visit, it was a passing of legacy, a connection between past and future that ran through the very ground he stood on. The veteran straightened as much as his body would allow and, with obvious effort, brought his hand up in a slow, respectful salute toward Marcus. It was a gesture of recognition between soldiers, an acknowledgement of shared duty across the decades. Marcus faced an impossible choice. Protocol demanded that he remain motionless, unresponsive. But here stood a man who had served in this very spot, who had given his life to the same cause Marcus now served. The rules seemed insignificant compared to the moment's deeper meaning. Very slowly, with the same deliberate precision he used in formal ceremonies, Marcus returned the salute. It was a perfect military gesture, executed with the full dignity of his uniform and position. For just a moment the decades collapsed and two guards saluted each other across time. The veteran's eyes filled with tears, but his salute never wavered. His daughter gasped softly, understanding the significance of what she was witnessing. Even the sleeping toddler seemed to sense the moment's importance, settling more peacefully in his stroller. After holding the salute for several seconds, both men slowly lowered their hands. The veteran nodded once, a gesture of deep respect and gratitude that conveyed more than words ever could. "Thank you, son," the old man said quietly. "You've made an old soldier very proud." Marcus returned to his position of attention, but his eyes continued to meet the veteran's. In that connection, he felt the weight of history, the responsibility of carrying forward a tradition that men like this had built with their lives in service. The family stayed for several more minutes, with the veteran pointing out various aspects of the palace to his sleeping great-grandson, sharing stories that the child was too young to understand, but that filled the winter air with the warmth of memory and love. When they finally prepared to leave, the veteran straightened one last time and nodded to Marcus. "Keep up the good work, guardsman. You're part of something that matters." As they walked away, the woman helped her father navigate the snowy path while pushing the stroller. Marcus watched them go, feeling changed by the encounter. The old guard's words echoed in his mind. "You're part of something that matters." That evening, as Marcus removed his uniform and prepared for the end of his shift, he thought about the veteran's visit. He realized that his role wasn't just about following rules or maintaining traditions. It was about being a link in a chain of service that connected generations, about honoring the men who had stood where he now stood, and about setting an example for those who might stand there in the future. The snow continued to fall outside the palace windows, but Marcus felt warmer than he had all day. He had learned that sometimes breaking protocol wasn't about abandoning duty. Sometimes it was about understanding what duty truly meant. Tomorrow he would return to his post, stand at attention, and maintain the traditions that men like the veteran had established. But he would also remember that beneath the formal uniform and strict protocols beat the heart of something much more human and meaningful, a commitment to service that transcended rules and connected souls across the generations. The February morning arrived with an unusual stillness, as if London itself was holding its breath. Guardsman Peter Wilson had been on duty for 2 hours when he noticed the woman sitting alone on the bench across from his post. She had been there when he arrived, and something about her posture suggested she had been there much longer. At 31, Peter was older than most guardsmen when they started, having served in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. He had learned to read people quickly during his military service overseas, and this woman's behavior set off quiet alarm bells in his mind. She sat perfectly still, staring at nothing in particular, with the kind of emptiness in her eyes that Peter recognized from his own dark moments after returning from combat. She was perhaps in her 40s, dressed in clothes that had once been nice but now looked slept in. Her dark hair was pulled back haphazardly, and she clutched a small handbag against her chest like a shield. Most concerning to Peter was the way she seemed completely disconnected from the world around her, unaware of the tourist walking past or the pigeons pecking near her feet. Around midday, the woman finally moved. She stood slowly, as if her limbs were stiff from sitting too long, and walked toward Peter's position. Her steps were measured but unsteady, and when she got close enough, Peter could see that her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you can't talk to me, but I just needed to tell someone." Peter remained at attention, but every instinct he had developed as a soldier was now focused on this woman. Something in her tone, her posture, the way she spoke suggested she was in crisis. "My name is Sarah," she continued, standing just outside the security barrier. "Sarah Mitchell. My husband David was a soldier. He died in Afghanistan 3 years ago." Peter felt his heart clench. He had lost friends in Afghanistan, had attended too many funerals, had seen too many families destroyed by that conflict. Sarah's voice grew shakier. "Today would have been our 15th wedding anniversary. I've been sitting here since dawn because I didn't know where else to go. David always said he wished he could have served here at the palace. He said it would have been the honor of his lifetime." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small framed photograph. Even from his position, Peter could see it showed a man in military uniform, smiling broadly with his arm around a younger, happier version of the woman standing before him. "I've been so angry," Sarah whispered, tears starting to flow. "Angry at David for leaving me, angry at the army, angry at God. I've been so lost without him. Some days I don't see the point in getting up." Peter's training in combat situations had included recognizing when someone might harm themselves. The way Sarah spoke, her isolation, the significance of the date, all of it painted a picture that terrified him. "I thought maybe if I came here, to the place David dreamed of serving, I might feel close to him again. Or at least understand what he died for." Her voice broke completely, "But I just feel more alone than ever." The courtyard was relatively quiet, with most tourists taking shelter from the cold February wind. Peter's commanding officer was inside the building for his weekly briefing. The other guards were positioned far enough away that they couldn't hear this conversation. Peter knew that what he was about to do could end his career. But he also knew that some things mattered more than careers. Very slowly, Peter turned his head toward Sarah. When their eyes met, he saw pain so deep it took his breath away. This wasn't just grief. This was a woman drowning in despair, looking for any reason to keep going. "Sarah," Peter said quietly, breaking perhaps the most fundamental rule of his position. "Your husband was a hero." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She looked around quickly to see if anyone else had heard, then stepped closer to the barrier. "You're not supposed to talk," she whispered. "No, I'm not," Peter agreed, still speaking softly. "But you need to know that David's service mattered. What he did mattered. And you matter too." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she clutched her husband's photograph tighter. Peter continued, his voice gentle but firm. I served in Afghanistan too. I knew men like your husband, brave, dedicated, who believed in something bigger than themselves. Their sacrifice wasn't meaningless, and neither is your pain. But I don't know how to go on without him, Sarah sobbed. You go on because he would want you to, Peter said. You go on because your life has value beyond what you shared with him. You go on because there are people who need you, even if you can't see them right now. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. How do you know? Because I've been where you are, Peter admitted. Different circumstances, same darkness. There were days I didn't want to see another sunrise. But I learned that grief isn't the enemy of love, it's love with nowhere to go. David's love for you doesn't end because he's gone. It becomes part of who you are. For several minutes they stood in silence. Sarah continued to cry, but something in her posture had changed. The hopelessness seemed to be lifting slightly. What should I do? She asked finally. First, you should call someone. A family member, a friend, a counselor. Promise me you won't spend today alone. Sarah nodded slowly. My sister has been trying to reach me for weeks. I haven't answered her calls. Call her, Peter urged. And second, you should know that David is proud of you for making it this far. Grief is its own kind of battlefield, and you've been fighting it for 3 years. That takes incredible strength. Sarah looked down at the photograph in her hands, then back up at Peter. Why did you risk getting in trouble to talk to me? Peter thought for a moment before answering. Because sometimes the most important duty isn't following orders. Sometimes it's just being human when someone needs it most. A small smile, the first Peter had seen from her, crossed Sarah's face. David would have said something like that. Then he was a good man and a good soldier. Sarah carefully put the photograph back in her handbag. I should go. I don't want to get you in trouble. Sarah, Peter called softly as she turned to leave. Will you do something for me? Will you come back in a few months and let me know how you're doing? She turned back, and Peter could see that something fundamental had shifted in her eyes. The emptiness was still there, but it was no longer absolute. I will, she promised. And thank you for seeing me, for speaking when you weren't supposed to, for reminding me that David's love doesn't have to die with him. As Sarah walked away, she stood a little straighter, moved with a little more purpose. She pulled out her phone and after a moment's hesitation made a call. Emma? Peter heard her say as she moved out of earshot. It's Sarah. I know I haven't called, but I really need my sister right now. Peter returned to his position of attention, his heart pounding with the weight of what had just happened. He had broken the most sacred rule of his position, risked his career, and violated years of training. But as he watched Sarah disappear into the London streets, talking animatedly on her phone, he knew he had done exactly the right thing. Some rules existed to maintain order, but some moments required choosing humanity over protocol. That evening, Peter wrote a letter to his commanding officer, explaining what had happened and accepting whatever consequences might follow. But he slept better that night than he had in months, knowing that sometimes the greatest service came not from standing perfectly still, but from moving when someone's life depended on it. 6 months had passed since the individual acts of compassion by various guardsmen had begun to quietly reshape the culture within the Queen's Guard. The stories had traveled through the ranks in whispered conversations and knowing glances, creating an unspoken understanding that duty sometimes required more than rigid adherence to protocol. Colonel Andrew Harrison had served the Crown for 35 years, rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected officers in the Queen's Guard. At 58, he had seen every kind of situation imaginable, trained hundreds of young guardsmen, and maintained the highest standards of military discipline. But lately, he had been hearing reports that troubled him deeply. On this warm June morning, Colonel Harrison decided to conduct an unscheduled inspection of the guards on duty. He arrived at Buckingham Palace in civilian clothes, positioning himself where he could observe, without being immediately noticed by his men. What he witnessed over the next hour would change everything. He watched as Guardsman Mitchell, the same James who had waved at the sick boy months earlier, stood perfectly at attention while a group of school children on a field trip gathered nearby. The children's teacher was trying to keep them quiet, but their excitement was infectious. One little boy kept trying to get closer to James, fascination written all over his face. Instead of maintaining rigid indifference, Colonel Harrison observed James make the subtlest eye contact with the child, giving him the tiniest smile that only someone looking carefully would notice. The boy's face lit up with joy, and he whispered excitedly to his classmates about the friendly guard. Across the courtyard, Sergeant Hayes was dealing with an elderly veteran who had begun telling stories about his own military service to anyone who would listen. Rather than ignore the man completely, Hayes gave occasional, almost imperceptible nods of acknowledgement, treating the veteran with the respect his service deserved. Most significantly, Colonel Harrison witnessed Guardsman Wilson, Peter, who had spoken to the grieving widow Sarah, interact with a young woman who appeared to be in distress. She had been crying near his post for several minutes, and while Peter maintained his official stance, Harrison could see him subtly angling his body to provide a sense of protection and comfort to the distraught woman. At first, Colonel Harrison felt his military training rebel against what he was seeing. These men were violating protocols that had stood for centuries. They were breaking rules that he himself had enforced throughout his career. But as he continued to watch, something unexpected happened in his thinking. He began to see the bigger picture. The tourists weren't just looking at statues or museum pieces. They were connecting with living symbols of service, dedication, and honor. The children weren't being intimidated by unapproachable figures. They were being inspired by examples of dignity and strength. The families weren't encountering cold indifference. They were experiencing the humanity that made their guardsmen's sacrifice meaningful. Colonel Harrison thought about his own son, Michael, who had been killed in Iraq 8 years earlier. Michael had been a lieutenant in the Royal Marines, and Harrison remembered the young man's letters home describing how much it meant to him when senior officers showed him small kindnesses during difficult times. Those gestures hadn't compromised military discipline. They had strengthened Michael's resolve to serve with honor. As the morning progressed, Harrison noticed something else remarkable. Despite these subtle acts of humanity, his guardsmen were performing their duties flawlessly. Their posture remained impeccable, their vigilance was unwavering, and their professionalism was beyond reproach. They had found a way to honor both their protocols and their compassion. Around noon, Harrison made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him just hours earlier. He walked directly up to Peter Wilson's post, still in his civilian clothes. "Guardsman Wilson," he said quietly. Peter's eyes widened slightly as he recognized his commanding officer, but he maintained his position. "At ease, son," Harrison said. "We need to talk." Peter relaxed slightly but remained ready for what he assumed would be severe disciplinary action. "I've been watching you and the other guardsmen this morning," Harrison continued. "I've seen the small gestures, the moments of human connection. By all rights, I should be writing up disciplinary reports." Peter's heart sank, but he met his colonel's gaze steadily. "However," Harrison continued, "I've also seen something else. I've seen guardsmen who understand that their true duty goes beyond following rules blindly. I've seen young men who recognize that they represent not just military discipline, but the very best of what it means to serve others." Peter remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "My son was killed in Iraq," Harrison said quietly. "Before he died, he wrote me a letter. In it, he said that the best officers he served under weren't the ones who followed every rule perfectly. They were the ones who understood when breaking a small rule served a larger purpose." The colonel paused, looking out over the courtyard where tourists continued to gather around his guardsmen. "I've spent my career believing that discipline meant rigid adherence to protocol, but watching you men today, I realize I may have been missing something important. The people who come here aren't just tourists. They're citizens we're sworn to serve. They're children who need inspiration, families who need connection, and sometimes people who desperately need to know that someone sees their pain." Harrison turned back to Peter. "Tell me about the woman, Sarah Mitchell." "I read your report," Peter straightened. "She was in crisis, sir. I believed she might harm herself if someone didn't intervene." "And you chose to risk your career to help her?" "Yes, sir. I would make the same choice again." Harrison nodded slowly. "She wrote a letter to the palace last month." "Did you know that?" Peter's eyes widened in surprise. "She thanked us for having guardsmen who understood that true strength sometimes means showing compassion. She's back in counseling, has reconnected with her family, and is volunteering with other military widows. She specifically requested that her letter be shared with the guardsmen who spoke to her that day." Tears formed in Peter's eyes. "Is she all right, sir?" "She's going to be fine, son. And that's because you understood something that no training manual could teach you. That sometimes our greatest service comes not from what we don't do, but from what we choose to do." Over the following weeks, Colonel Harrison quietly implemented changes that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He began training sessions on compassionate service, teaching guardsmen how to maintain their dignity and effectiveness while still connecting with the people they served. He established guidelines that allowed for subtle human gestures when appropriate, while maintaining the high standards that made the Queen's Guard legendary. Most importantly, he began sharing the stories. James and the sick boy, William and the veteran's family, David and Sophie in the rain, Marcus and the old soldier, and Peter and Sarah. These became teaching tools, examples of how true service sometimes required the courage to be human in moments when humanity mattered most. The Queen herself, when briefed on these developments, smiled and made a comment that would become legendary within the Guard. "A guard who cannot show compassion when it's needed most is not truly guarding what matters." Years later, visitors to Buckingham Palace would notice something different about the Queen's Guard. They maintained their legendary discipline and bearing, but there was something more, a warmth, a connection, a recognition that their service was about more than just following orders. They had learned that true strength sometimes came not from standing perfectly still, but from knowing when to move, when to see, when to care. The red tunics and bearskin hats remained the same. The protocols were still followed, and the traditions were honored. But beneath the formal exterior, these guardsmen carried something new. The understanding that their greatest duty was not just to protect a building or follow rules, but to represent the very best of human service, dignity and compassion. And in doing so, they had transformed not just their own understanding of duty, but the experience of every person who encountered them, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to be human when humanity is needed most.